welcome back, everybody. It's another episode of the Nonprofit Show. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I get a little stressed out about, I've got to admit. It's financial planning and dealing with constant change. And how do we do this as nonprofits? How can we prepare and adjust? Our guests today, Taylor MacDonald and Dan Holcomb, they're going to say we can make changes, we can adjust, and we can prepare in a certain way when we're looking at this. So I'm very, very interested in learning what they have to say and how we can navigate change, because as we all know, it's the only thing that's constant. Hey, we also have amazing, consistent and constant presenting sponsors that join us. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome Taylor MacDonald. He is the CEO of Martus. Taylor, talk to us about what your company does to kind of help level set us before we dig into this conversation with Dan.
Well, thank you, Julia. It's great to be here. Martus is the leader in providing collaborative budgeting, personnel planning, dashboards, reporting, and cash flow forecasting to nonprofits and faith-based institutions. It's that simple. Those are the things that we help those organizations do to get their arms around what's going on in their financial world.
Wow. Okay. So I love how you said it's that simple, but it's really complicated, I think, when you're trying to figure all this out. And so I'm really interested in getting your guidance and, if not just the approval for how we go about this. Dan Holcomb, welcome back from JMT Consulting. We're thrilled to have you talk with us about this issue and how we can look at all of these things that just make us all have a lot of stress. And that's never a good thing, is it?
Never.
It's never a good thing. Okay, so let's talk about this. And Taylor, I'll start with you. We always think about change is, something that we can plan for, but it's really gotten pretty wacky in the last few years. We've had a lot of changes. How do you see this all playing out? Is this just what we have to live with?
I think we will, and change is accelerated from the pandemic. It's accelerated from social media. It's accelerated from technology, in particular AI. And we can put our hands in the sand and think that we're back 15 or 20 years ago, but that's not the right answer.
Yeah. I love that you used the word acceleration. I hadn't necessarily applied that word to change, but you're absolutely right. That's a good way to look at it. Dan, what have you and the team at JMT seen with change and moving that?
Yeah, we're absolutely in agreement with this, and the fact that all the clients that we service, right, at the end of the day, they're dealing with it, right. The change is moving at a very rapid pace, which is good and scary at the same time, but we're definitely there for our clients. And that's, with Martus as well, has been a very powerful tool to help them, kind of process that change a lot easier throughout their fiscal year, basically.
Mm-hmm. So Taylor, if we think about the escalation of change, does that mean we're quicker in, but we're quicker out too?
With that, while Dan was giving his remarks, I was thinking about that exact same thought, which is, yes, there's this acceleration. Yes, there's this speed, but it also means that in many cases we're getting more done more quickly. And that is a huge benefit. And it's a huge benefit, especially in the nonprofit world, about being able to serve more people, about being able to accomplish their mission more easily with technology. And I think we have to look at it, and AI in particular is incredibly scary. We're going to get to that, I'm sure, at the end. But it's also this great enabler of being able to do things that at some points you wouldn't be able to do. And so I think we have to look at change both as, boy, it is scary, it can be scary, but at the same point, it's exhilarating.
Right. And I love that you use that word, because exhilarating, because I've always lived with this notion that in change, that's where opportunity comes. That's like, for me, and I don't know if that's just my own attitude. I'm not really sure, but it just seems to me like that's where you can really lean in and get new things going and identify new things and maybe be the first one in to acknowledge it. So, but we haven't always thought of these things when it comes to accounting and to financial planning, right? Dan, you're smiling because you're like, yeah, this isn't the way we always think about analyzing our businesses.
It's exactly right, and that's one of the key features is the fact that we see it every day, with our clients. The change is it's scary for them, but at the same time, we're able to kind of turn the table and kind of show them that it's not always a bad thing. That always improving and always making a situation better, and making really at the end of the day the stress go away if we can. Right, that's what our focus has been about, and utilizing tools like we use here at JMT to make that process better for them.
Right.
I think, Julia, to add on to that, I think 5 or 10 years ago, organizations could build an annual budget. It would remain stable and they'd keep that same budget, right? Well, today they're navigating economic uncertainty, challenging donor behavior, workforce shortages, all those things, inflation. And the challenge just isn't any one event, it's the frequency of change. And so we can't control the external events, but we can be prepared for how to respond. So meaning, hey, do we have a contingency plan if our big donor doesn't come through or the like? And that's just good management and good stewardship, if you will, of nonprofit organizations.
It's Taylor, you brought up some really interesting points, and it makes me think like this is almost like a mindset shift, that we're like saying, wow, okay, acknowledging that these changes are going to go on. It's more, how do we acknowledge what we're going to do? Does that make sense?
We have to. Again, if we think that we're back 10 years ago or a generation ago, then we're endangering our overall survival. And I think we just have to realize that change is coming. It's whether your organization is ready when it does.
Mm-hmm. And that's like leads me to my next big question, because this is if we're thinking about doing things differently and being more prepared, what should that look like? I mean, because how many of us prepared for a global pandemic, or how many of us have been then preparing for shifts in demographics in the labor structure that we have right now in our country, the economy? What are you suggesting that we kind of financially prepare, and not only how we do it, but maybe how we're communicating that back out to our stakeholders and our board members of why and how we should be doing this?
Well, I'm happy to take a stab at it. I think the most resilient organizations are those that have thought through multiple scenarios of what could happen, and that they're financially prepared, and that they're making those proactive decisions and not waiting until uncertainty becomes reality. And I know we've worked with the JMT team for a long time. I've known Jackie Tissot from my days at Intact, but this means not going and saying, hey, what will happen? But what happens if donations fall by 10%? What happens if a grant funding is delayed? What happens if a certain key staff member leaves? Having it's risk management coupled with financial planning, so that when you think through those questions, that you'll probably never be ready to respond to any of those, but you'll have some idea of how to respond. You might have a forecast in a play that you can go bring out that reflects what that scenario is. So that's just good stewardship. Just like we talk again about all of us saying, hey, you're supposed to have 6 months of cash on hand if you lost your job, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's smart planning, because we know that it happens. People get laid off. This is the exact same thing from this standpoint. And of course, nonprofits are in a completely different financial world than for-profits. Their lifelines can be tenuous. They're continually fundraising. They're at the mercy in many cases, as we've seen, at the government. And so what you get is that it's even more important in this case to do this kind of proactive planning than it is for a for-profit company.
Yeah, Dan, that's an interesting aspect because I've never heard it verbalized that way, that we need to analyze this thing even more with more robustly, right? Because things are tenuous and so much out of our control. I mean, a donor that we expect to be working with, and we've been working with them for decades, and all of a sudden that falls apart. It's a frightening proposition.
Exactly, and Taylor hit the nail on the head. At the end of the day, it's about being proactive, not reactive. Right? We're not going to be able to, have every answer, every solution, but at least we're going to have the mindset of how to attack those situations to the best of our ability. And I think that's something that I see, especially with a lot of our clients that are global. That there's areas of the world that are impacted right now through conflict that is actually impacting these nonprofits, and they do all these different types of programs and things like that they're relying on for financial means for the organization. So we see it a lot. We see a lot of things that are uncertain and doing the best they can to minimize the impact on the organization while still fulfilling their mission.
Right. Can the two of you give us some ideas as to some general areas that we should be thinking about in these scenario plans? Like Taylor, you brought up, the change of a donor or a major structure within, maybe your top donors or everything. And you mentioned labor. What are some of the other areas that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think that given that almost all nonprofits are required to have a budget and a plan, that's a great place to start. I don't care whether you're doing in Excel, whether you're using one of our competitors using an upmarket product. That doesn't matter. What matters is doing it, number one. And number two is move away from this concept of annual budget that we all grew up with, that, hey, it started and that's the plan. We got to get special dispensation to change it, right? Instead, we want to think of monthly and quarterly budgets, and we want to have scenarios where we're building different scenarios, best case, worst case, certain things happening. And then also at the same time, looking at the trends that are important for whether you're a faith-based or a grant-based. So that could be things like donations, grant activities, general cash flow, large expenditures that are coming, and being able to put those into discretionary and non-discretionary budgets. One of the things that we've seen, we sort of offer three different versions of our product, but the premium version is one that has cash flow forecasting in it. Well, nonprofits, that's the whole deal, is cash flow forecasting. Right? Yeah. And again, do it in a spreadsheet. Just do it, because what happens when you realize that you're 15 days out or 30 days out or 45 days out away from a cash crunch, that puts your employees at risk. It puts the mission at risk. It makes people uneasy within the organization. And then you go call your special donor and say, hey, can you please accelerate your donation or whatnot? Yeah. That's the stress that we want to avoid.
Yep.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing because we were talking in the green room about shifting our mindsets about this operational aspect, and that it's not a one and done. I heard something really interesting from you, Taylor, and I just want to drill down a little bit more, and that is the frequency with which you're looking at this. It's not just something that you do in budget month every July or whatever it is. Talk to us a little bit about that.
And so one of the things, we serve over 25 different types of nonprofit organizations. Julia, you're very familiar with them. I mean, there's things like associations, there's faith-based, there's grant-based, there's schools, and we serve all of those. I think it's important to go think about the volatility in those organizations. So a K through 12 school that has tuition and the like and gifts, their volatility is probably substantially less, and you could get by with quarterly planning. If you're, we serve a lot of visit organizations, so Visit Phoenix, Visit Dallas, right? They're the old Chamber of Commerce's sort of reimagined. They don't have a lot of volatility in their world, but when we're in the grant-based world, when we're in the faith-based world, and others where we are at the dependent on donations and in churches tithing and the like that could be easily interrupted with a stock market crash or whatnot. I think those people should be doing it almost continuously and looking at what the first 2 months of the year, what the first 4 months of the year, and then going and having a forecast. So the first 4 months were this. Here's what we originally had the plan. Should we go reforecast the second half of the year? One of the things that we've also found is that, and it's sort of a sleeper feature of Martus, is personnel budgeting. Well, in most nonprofits, other than going and doing the actual mission that you're doing and the money that's spent on that, the next biggest expense for everybody is people. And so being able to budget at every person's level, all the way out to their deductions and their any 401 contributions or medical plans, to really understand what your total personnel cost is, especially when we look at the other side as employers of FICA and FUTA and the like. That getting a real handle on your personnel costs, I think, is one of those absolute critical first steps.
Amazing. Dan, when you go before a client and they've done their financial forecasting a certain way, maybe they learned it in school, maybe that's always the way it's been done. How hard is it to get somebody to kind of like switch their brain and recognize we need to be thinking about this differently? Because this seems to me to be like a heavy lift.
It is, and it can be, and that's the key, and it goes back to what we started with on the show is change, right? It's right. Getting the mindset to change, and it's a behavior that we have to work with those clients on a routine basis, right? So not just like a budget, it's not a one and done, right? At the end of the day, it's a continuous cycle working with those clients to kind of walk them through, right, the best practice or the best way and the best approach that we've seen with other clients and other situations that are very similar per se, and how they can, have a better outcome, by doing it this way as opposed to doing it the way that they've been used to doing it. So that's really the approach we try to take with our clients and getting them and steering them in the right direction.
Right. I'm going to press you a little bit on that, because so many organizational budgets come through the board or maybe a finance committee or a budget committee. How are you seeing boards understanding this? I mean, are they willing to, navigate in a new way, or are you seeing some pushback on this?
I think it goes both ways, really. I think at the end of the day, but I think what you're seeing is that the more confidence that they see in the organization, and especially on the finance side of it, as far as like their budgeting and their forecasting and then staying on top of it and really keeping them informed, is really the key piece here, because it's giving them the confidence that they can follow, what the organization is doing and where every penny is accounted for is really, the biggest piece of it, because they're just as invested as anybody else in the organization at the end of the day, because ultimately they are the responsible party. But the reality is that I think starting with, getting that confidence between the two, as far as the board and the actual organization, I think that's where it starts. And again, like I said, we're not getting as much pushback as people might think. It's actually more, they're embracing the culture of, the organization trying to do better.
Right.
Julia, I think one of the things that JMT does very well that might be overlooked is, it's one thing if in your organization, Dan comes in and teaches you how to use a product like Martus. Again, it could be an Excel template. It could be anything. Martus is a proxy here, right? And so you go start to use it. Well, that doesn't mean you're going to end up with a great budget. And so there's so much more involved with and what JMT does and other partners and accounting firms and your part-time controller. That's a great organization we have a relationship with. They're actually helping the organization look at it line by line and going through it and pressure testing it to say, are these the right numbers? Because if they're wrong, then you don't have a very good budget. And that is over half the whole part of doing that. And many people, unfortunately, you don't get taught how to run a budget cycle in high school, college, whatever. And so we're introducing some technology built with AI to go do a budget navigator, to go help people make sure that they're going to get their budget delivered on time and the like. And it goes with the same thing of when one of Dan's clients sends a financial statement to a board member, parts of the Martus reports have a special color underlined. And so you can go drill down and somebody could say, well, why are salaries so much? So then I can go look and there's a note there, because the last thing you want to do is freak a board member out with something over budget. And of course, most people would go and send it anyway, but then there's always a finance person or two on the boards, right? Yep. They're going to want to drill down and say, okay, what was this?
Right. What does it look like? So when we talk about this, it seems to me like we're in a time when we're creating new best practices. And I'm wondering, and we don't have a lot of time left, but could you talk to us about maybe like what you're seeing as just the top things that we should all be thinking about, especially if we're having to refine the way we're approaching budget season?
So I think the two or three things that I would immediately say is we say Martus is a collaborative budgeting tool. That means that other people in the organization will do it. So don't do a budget in isolation. That's number one. Number two is keep your eyes and ears open. The departmental leaders, others in these organizations, they see and hear changes before those results come up in a financial report, right? And when you bring all of the perspectives of the people, the financials, and have them being done on a real-time basis, if you will, not getting a financial report the 20th of the following month, all of that allows you to better manage your organization and be better stewards.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's brilliant. And I think that might seem somewhat new to some groups, because it seems like we've always kind of pawned off that process to a few people, and it hasn't been so collaborative. Dan, I see you shaking your head. You're like, yeah.
I agree. I mean, it's a hands down agreement here. I mean, because the reality is every organization that I've come across is finance tends to be the gatekeeper, right? They're the ones that's responsible doing the budget. Well, guess what? Finance doesn't always know what's going on the outside of the world, right? When it comes to different departments, different areas of the organization. And so we're seeing that, and especially with a tool like Martus, and there's other tools, but Martus has been a very powerful tool in this field of collaboration. And that's what it's about, because you're able to communicate, you're able to, get the insight that you're looking for within the organization without having to chase things down via email or other means, and wasting time at the end of the day. But that's it. It's the collaboration, because communication, collaboration, that's the critical piece in any organization at the end of the day.
I love it. Well, let's finish up today. And this is probably one of those areas that it's like, it's everywhere, and yet it's nowhere in so many ways. And that is the AI aspect to drafting these things and crafting these things and making them a tool that we can use. What are both of you seeing, and how this technology is impacting the process?
So, Julia, you may have seen way back when in the 1990s that X is like teenage sex. Everybody's talking about it, everybody's doing it, but nobody's doing it, right? Yeah. Remember that meme, if you will?
Yeah.
So that's the appropriate one here.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
I think for everyone that's people are using it productively, there's 12 train wrecks, right?
Right.
We have all asked AI, whether it's Google with Gemini in for something, and you go, that's wrong, right?
Right.
That fact is wrong. And so I think first piece with AI is it, can you trust the results? Can you do this? I was reading about one this morning about where somebody had had taken financial statement, used AIs to create board reports. Nobody had looked at the board reports, and they were wrong. Okay. So AI doing those board reports was a huge help, but not going and trust and verify was a train wreck. And so I think that we all understand that AI can help us gather data more quickly, generate reports faster, analyze trends and all, but those can't be done in a vacuum without somebody who knows and understands what the right answers look like. There was another report this week that a number of law schools are banning AI in year one, not because they don't want their students using it, but that they feel that year one is where students learn to think and articulate about how the law works. And if you let AI do all that, you miss all that learning. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So I think AI is a great tool. We've got a number of AI features in Martus that are helping people, but without that oversight, then you may be risking your career, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, Dan, I'm sure you've got some opinions on this as well.
Oh, agree. I mean, that's the thing, AI, it's not, I wouldn't say fresh out of the box, but it is a new feature for a lot of especially nonprofits, because they're not as exposed to it as you would probably see in, say, the corporate world, right? But the reality is like, like Taylor said, even with, different AI tools, you gotta vet the information, right? At the end of the day, you've got to vet it, and you're the key holder, really, at the end of the day, of whether that information is accurate or even seems accurate. Because the last thing you want to do is send that information on to a board or other areas of the organization, and it's flawed. I mean, that goes back to the whole confidence thing, right? And how we can work together and provide that mission successfully.
Yeah, really interesting. I think that it also seems to me that we're learning a lot of new skill sets because we have new tools, right? And it seems to me that this is like part of that, almost like that journey of bringing in outside knowledge, bringing in outside tools, more modern technology to help us with a process that probably hasn't changed that much, right? I mean, and I think we forget that. I mean, a lot of what's going on right now, the budgeting process for many professionals has probably been the exact same for decades. And now we're saying, okay, wait a minute, let's rethink this. Are the two of you seeing stuff like that?
Yeah, one of the things that goes with that, I think, though, is I've been involved in the accounting profession a long time. The number of CPAs that are retiring over the next 10 years is 30 or 40% of the profession. So there's this huge change, and I'm sure it's the same within the finance directors and CFOs of nonprofits. But what I would say that is encouraging, and I want to be encouraging to people, is AI is one of those things that will keep us young, us older folks, because it will force us to learn new things. Our brain works best when we're constantly learning and we're constantly having to try to learn new skills, use new ideas and the like. And one of the reasons I was excited to take over the reins for our founder, Bill Cox, is that we're entering into this AI world. It's going to be a lot quicker than what we saw in the cloud. The cloud's been around now 25 years. The AI thing is going to be compressed into the world of smartphones. When Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, it was 3 or 4 or 5 years to total adoption, right? You were an outlier if you had a flip phone. It's going to be the same with AI. And I'm just trying to encourage people. I've seen lots of my colleagues get off the bus here because I think they say, I can't go do one more thing. I actually think it should be the opposite. It's a reason to stay and keep you young.
Yep.
That may not have exactly answered the question, but I think it's an important message.
Yeah, no, and I think it speaks to so much of what we've talked about today, in my mind, has been mindset, right? It's thinking about things in a new and different way, and which is very exciting. Taylor MacDonald, he is the newly named CEO of Martus. You can check out their work and their products at martussolutions.com. That's MARTUS solutions.com. Dan Holcomb has joined us from the team at JMT Consulting. And Dan, it's been great to have you on this conversation because it's such an interesting time to be rethinking how we live through this very, very important part of financial planning for our organization. So thank you both for joining.
Pleasure.
Thrilled to.
It's been a lot of fun. Hey, you know, we get to have these conversations day in and day out about all different things because we have phenomenal partners. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. These are the folks that help us set our plans, and for so many others, they help set the plans across our nonprofit sector. So we want to make sure that we express our gratitude. As we end each and every episode, we leave with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.